Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is Remarkable Books Review number 2. Our first book today is the Bible. Well, actually the Bible is many books, 'cause at least that's how it's considered. Like the first Genesis is considered a book, and we think of it as a chapter, although people don't buy the books separately. They all come in one volume, which is nice. Anyway, the Bible is an amazing book, a wonderful book, a tremendous book. The Old Testament has, it's like the history of the Jewish people, and it has a lot of really good stories, very inspiring stories. The story of Joseph, whose brothers were jealous of him and sold him into slavery. They were going to kill him at first. He was the youngest, and he was favored by the father and was given the very nice coat. Anyway, as a slave, a powerful woman tried to seduce him, and then he wouldn't go for it, and then so she accused him of rape, and then he was imprisoned. He was a slave in prison. So how bad can that be? But he was a good man, and this is in Egypt, and the Pharaoh had these dreams that troubled him, and Joseph was able to interpret them, and he became powerful, and he saved the Middle East from famine, and then his brothers came, and then he forgave them. He was very angry. That's a wonderful story. And then Moses, when Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt back to Israel. Wonderful story. The story of Job, and story of David. David, who as a boy killed this giant Goliath, and then became a great king of Israel. And although he made mistakes, he saw this woman that he wanted, and she was married, and he had named Bathsheba, and then he had her husband killed. That was terrible. And then, but he paid for it. We all pay for our sins. There are consequences for our actions. And then David's their first child died, and then they had a second son named Absalom, who grew up to betray David. Started a civil war against his father, and then eventually died. And that was David paid for it. We all pay. We can't. No one gets away with anything. That's why we should always try to be good people, because there's love, karma's true. If we do good things will come to us. And if we do bad things will happen. Then there's King Solomon in the Old Testament, this very wise man, who was also a king and had 1,000 wives, kind of puzzling. And he built pagan temples for some of them who were pagan wives. That's kind of a strange story. And then, of course, the New Testament with life of Jesus Christ, his amazing life, wonderful life, his death on the cross, and how he asked, as he was dying, God to forgive those who were killing him. Wonderful spirit and attitude. And then, how the disciples all, they all were afraid of being arrested. They all betrayed him, and only John came to his, when he was crucified. That's why John became such a popular name in different countries. And then Peter felt so bad, especially because, and then he apologized when Jesus came back on Easter, and then Jesus forgave him. And so, what a wonderful message Christianity is. So important. We need God. We need God's help, and we need to establish a stronger relationship with God, and we need to love each other and love God. So the Bible is a wonderful, wonderful book, and it has history, there's entertainment and drama, and also spirituality to help us to live our lives. Okay, the next book is The Crash of '79 by Paul Erdman, published in 1976. This is a pretty easy book, and this Paul Erdman was like a financial analyst, and this is a financial thriller. It's about money, and it's about an economic catastrophe, and there's a lot of, it's kind of like James Bond. This guy's traveling from Zurich and London and Paris, New York, and a lot of, high rolling monkey business. It's a great book, very entertaining, and kind of out of date now since this is 2017. But we still could have this financial catastrophe that he was writing about, because this was based on, he was a banker. He knew what was going on. Okay, the next book is Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, published in 1920. And Sinclair Lewis is a wonderful writer. He writes about America in the 1920s, and it really gives you it's not too tough to read, and the book it's very engaging, and it's a snapshot of life in the United States at that time. Very different life. That's almost 100 years ago, and when people were kind of everyone's in a hurry, and it was the spirit of the country was much more optimistic than it is now. And this Main Street is about a small town and the people there, and it's a very good story. Next book is Babbitt, also by Sinclair Lewis, published in 1922. A similar story. This Babbitt is he's a businessman. He's promoting his town and so forth, and you can see the life back then in these small towns. People were kind of too nosy, and they were kind of bossy, and there was kind of restrictive, in terms if you tried to be different. So there was some cultural pressure, which is true everywhere. But more people, a lot stronger relationships, I think, in the small towns. So the people were, which in a way was good, in a way was bad, because people had less freedom, but they were less lonely. Sinclair Lewis is a very fine writer, and his books aren't too tough, and they're good, really good stories. He could really write. He could really write well. The next book is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, Spanish author, and it was written in 1615. So that's this is 300 years ago. This is a very, very good book. It's translated into the English, and it's funny. This character, Don Quixote, is this guy. He reads a lot of books, and he wants to have adventures, and so he decides to go off, and become a knight and fight bad guys, fight villains. And there's this woman that he's fighting for, although she doesn't really know who and I think she's a prostitute, that he decides she's his this fair maiden. And so it's very funny. It's a very funny story. At one point, his eyesight is poor, and he sees a windmill, and he thinks it's a dragon. He read too many books. It's kind of like me, and his imagination runs wild. So he's takes off for this what he thinks is a dragon with his horse, and he's got a a sword or a long pole to fight the dragon. And that's the expression we get, tilting at windmills. That it wasn't a dragon, it was a windmill. So it's a very funny story, and this guy's going off. He gets into a lot. People get mad at him because he's kind of crazy, and is always thinking in terms of himself as being a great knight and a great hero. A wonderful, wonderful book. The next book is Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley in 1818. So this is about 200 years old. Mary Shelley was a young girl. She was maybe 19 when she wrote this book, and she was with some friends. They were telling stories, and she came up with this story just out of the blue, out of her imagination. And they said, Mary, that's a great story. We should write it down. So she did. And it's an amazing story. Not too long, not too hard, and it's about this Victor Frankenstein who decides to try to create a human being from body parts. He goes to the cemetery, he gets these body parts, and he's able to bring this to create a human being from dead body parts. And he works too hard. It's everything's too hard, and when the creature comes to life, he's so tired, and then he kind of regrets it, and he thinks it's horrible, and he leaves it. He goes off, and he gets very sick, and this creature is abandoned. It's all alone. It doesn't know anything. It knows that it's hungry. It's kind of and the poor Frankenstein's monster gets into trouble, and people are scared of him, and then finally he's on his own. He's been abandoned, and then so he finally finds out what happened, and he tracks down Victor Frankenstein, and he says, he's like, well, he's so mad at him. How could you do this? You made me and abandoned me. And then he says, you have to. I'm lonely, and no one likes me. You have to make me a partner. So Victor agrees to create a female monster, and but near the end he thinks, oh my God, this is terrible, and he destroys this female monster, and so the monster is real mad. He won't have a wife, and then at the end, he's like chasing Victor in the Arctic until Victor, I think, died, and then the monster lights himself on fire in a big, and he dies. It's a very sad ending in the Arctic Ocean. It's an incredible story, very, very entertaining. Okay, the next story is Dracula by Bram Stoker, written in 1897. So this is more than 100 years old, and the story of Dracula. It's in Rome, what's now Romania, the Transylvanian Alps, and excuse me. this Dracula, this guy is like the movies, he's sleeping during the day, and he has to drink blood, and attacks people, and they become like him, the undead, so-called undead, these sort of pathetic people who are like him, and so it's a bummer, it's kind of a terrible story, but anyway, it's horror, it's scary and so forth. Okay, the next book is For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. Came out in 1940. And this is a very wonderful book. It's about a guy in the Spanish Civil War. And that's what it's all about. And, this was during in the 1930s in Spain. And Ernest Hemingway came and was involved in that as a journalist, and then this was a war between the two forces in Spain, between the communists and the fascists, and Hemingway is promoting the communist side, who were a lot of idealists, and then the title. So it's a war book, and it's kind of inspiring, being part of a noble cause, in this case the communist cause, but at least there were a lot of people who have gotten involved in communism. I don't believe in communism now, but a lot of good people have been kind of wrapped up in the ideals of that movement, and and then the title comes from when people are dying, and when they die, they ring the church bells for a funeral, and so the guy says, well, I wonder who that bell's for, and the guy says, well, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. In other words, when people die, we're all linked together. We're all children of God, and we all need to help each other and love each other. So we can't just say, "Oh, that's not my problem," that we have to care. We have to care about others. Okay, the next book is the USA Trilogy by John Dos Passos. Came out in 1938. Really, really good book. Really long. Not hard to read. And actually, I was in the Philippines for many years, and he talks about the Philippines because the American occupation, and he keeps repeating this line: "Many a man has been killed in Luzon and Mindanao," and that's a repetitive line. And I was reading it when I first came to the Philippines. It kind of troubled me, but it's about America in the early part of the 20th century, kind of like Sinclair Lewis. This, if you want to get a feel of what the United States was like back then. It's a very, very well written book. Okay, the next book is The Boys of Summer by Roger Kahn, published in 1972. This is a wonderful book about the Brooklyn Dodgers. This baseball team played in Brooklyn, New York, in the New York City area, and moved to Los Angeles in 1958, I believe, 57, 58, and it's about Brooklyn and about the players, and the guys like Duke Snider and Jackie Robinson and so forth, and they won the championship in 1955, and Brooklyn and the fans. And it was very hard, when they lost their team. The team moved away. Very hard, very heartbreaking for these Brooklyn Dodgers fans. And so it's all about the players and the fans. And I kind of find it very touching. It's very touching. And Roger Kahn tracked down these former players when they were older. They'd been through a lot. Roy Campanella and Don Newcomb and so forth. And the Brooklyn Dodgers, really interesting story. Okay, the next book is Me and the Spitter by Gaylord Perry and with Bob Sudyk, published in 1974. So the title, gave fits to English teachers, Me and the Spitter. Now, this is about, Gaylord Perry was playing for the Cleveland Indians at this time, and he had it was about about his career, and, he threw a spitball. And so it was his life in baseball, and the spitball is illegal in baseball. You're not supposed to use throw a spitball, because it's considered unfair advantage for the pitcher. But, he was trying to, make a living and keep playing baseball, so he did it. And, there was a lot of suspicion, and he was very effective. He was a tremendous pitcher for the Cleveland Indians, for a lot of teams, San Francisco Giants, and he played for the Texas Rangers and so forth. So, and this local sports writer, Bob Sudyk, helped him write this book. The next book is Out of Bounds by Jim Brown. Came out in 1989. Jim Brown was the former NFL player who played for the Cleveland Browns. And this is about, his memories. And he's also kind of critical of the later players for not, being as tough. And I remember he used to criticize Franco Harris for not, going out of bounds and not trying to get more yardage. So he was, tremendous football player, and he got into politics. He's very active in helping African Americans do better as a whole, as a people, like Martin Luther King. And so he's very outspoken. He was controversial. Some people didn't like him being so political. Jim Brown. Okay, the next book is Cancer Ward by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, and it was published in 1966. And this is a tremendous book. It's about the Soviet Union, and and actually Solzhenitsyn was one of the major forces that helped end the Soviet Union. A lot, like I said earlier, there are a lot of people who believe in communism, idealistic people. They care about the poor and so forth, and want life to be good for everyone. And so when the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917, a lot of folks in the U.S. and in Europe thought, oh, this is a really good thing. Oh, they're really doing something good over there. And especially when there were hard times in the 1930s, people thought, oh, the Russians, the Russian Revolution, it's better. And this book is really shows how bad things were in the Soviet Union, how evil and how cruel, and this. I think communism is, the Soviet Union was the biggest fraud in world history. They talked about, we're creating a wonderful society, a brotherhood and so forth, and it was a fraud because the communist elites, they enjoyed tremendous power and and wealth. And the common people, they couldn't vote, and so many of them were arrested and taken away to the Gulag Archipelago. So It just was terrible. They were not creating a world brotherhood. They created a nightmare. It was just an absolute nightmare. And the poor people in the Soviet Union, the Russians and the other ethnic groups in that country, who suffered so much and were like slaves and were really, really very badly treated and much worse than the czars had treated the Russian people. Okay, the next book is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner, published in 1929. I read this book in high school, and I found it very difficult, actually. And I'll have to read it now. I find I was a junior in high school, and wow, tough book, very, very tough. And I think I read it twice, and didn't understand anything. So anyway, Faulkner's a Southerner, and this is from what I remember the story. Yeah, that's characters, and it's kind of a dark story. And like I said, he's highly, highly respected. Considered one of the classic authors of all time, but I read him in high school. I think I was way too young. It was way too hard for me to read. Okay, the next book is East of Eden by John Steinbeck, written in 1952. This is a very long book, and it's pretty good. I like Grapes of Wrath better, but this is, Steinbeck had to keep writing books, and this is one of them. It's with characters in California, and can't tell you much more about it. I don't remember much more, but I know my father was having heart surgery when I was reading this in 1988. Okay, the next book is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, published in 1862. This is a very, Victor Hugo, this is his second. He wrote the two famous books, The Hunchback of Notre Dame and now Les Miserables, which in English means like the miserables or the miserable people. And it's about the poor people in France, in Paris at that time in the middle of the 1800s, and they're suffering. And this character, Jean Valjean, who goes to prison for for stealing some bread. So this is a real book. I think this did a lot of good too, because they were, it was very cruel time, cruel era, and and so this book tried to shine light on that cruelty and inhumanity, and help create a more humane world. We live in a much more humane world today, and I think books like this had an impact, and they had the Broadway play Les Miserables, which has been very popular and all over the country. Okay, the next book is Anna Karenina by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, published in 1877. Now, this Dostoyevsky is another, along with Tolstoy, one of the famous Russian authors, and this character, this book, it's pretty tough reading, and it's pretty dark, and tragic. There's kind of gloomy, the Russian story, and with the cold weather, and sort of the oppressive culture of the, and so forth. And you had the elite Russians, they're very wealthy and they're having their parties and sort of living sort of empty lives. And then the mass, this is why the Russian Revolution broke out. The masses were really so super, super poor, and the elite were just sort of partying and lazy and interested in clothes and so forth. Okay, so that's it's a good story if you get into it. It takes a while. Okay, the next book is Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, published in 1901. And I was given this book to read when I was depressed. I've had depression, and so I don't have a very favorable view of the book. I remember there's a character who was diabetic, and he had money, and his family wouldn't let him have donuts and cookies and cake and pies and so forth. And so he rented out a secret apartment where he would keep sweet things and go there and eat them. And I was at a Thanksgiving dinner, and these people, they all loved Buddenbrooks and thought it was a wonderful book. And I said, I didn't like it. And they all stopped talking and looked at me. And I said, but I was depressed when I read it. Okay, the next book is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, written in 1859. And the two cities are Paris and London. And a lot of this is the French Revolution. And there's this madame, there's this female character who's in Paris during the Revolution, very poor, and she's knitting while watching, people having their heads cut off by the guillotine in the Reign of Terror, and I can't remember her name, but anyway, so there's a lot of stuff about the French Revolution and all the chaos and madness and so forth, and also about London at the same time. The next book is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, published in 1925. This is his most famous book, and it's taught in schools a lot. There's this movie that came out with Leonardo DiCaprio, and Fitzgerald's a wonderful writer. This is his most famous book, and he was an alcoholic, tragically, and it really ruined his life. Well, he died younger, and it affected his work, but... And this book is about this character, he's kind of mysterious. And Fitzgerald was a great writer, a wonderful writer. And this is fairly short, not too hard. It's a good story. And it's about the times, and America way back when, about 100 years ago. Another book is This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald, came out in 1920. I like this actually a lot more than... The Great Gatsby, and this is an interesting time in American history, and you can see they had prohibition, which they outlawed alcohol, and the First World War had a very powerful effect on people. They were so disillusioned, because there was so much suffering, and it seemed to be senseless. People lost faith in institutions and in their church because a lot of the ministers and priests encouraged the young men to go off, and it seemed like such a senseless war. So they call it the lost generation. People were kind of lost, and there was tremendous economic growth. Yet the automobile was coming, and life was changing. The modern world was coming, and so he writes very, very well. It's pretty easy to read and a good story. The next book is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. That came out in 1847. So this is pretty old, and it's about this character, and I can't remember a lot about it. It's a classic novel, and about a character in England, and can't tell you much more about that. I plowed my way through because I wanted to read the classic novels. I wanted people to respect me because I had read them, and many people. I probably would benefit from reading that again if I wanted to, because even though there are many other books to read. Okay, the next book is Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, published in 1872. And he's a wonderful writer. He's the father of science fiction. And this is my favorite book, and because I love geography. And, he has this character, Phileas Fogg, who's in London, and ends up getting involved in a bet that, this is the transportation revolution era, with railroads and steamships, and people could move a lot faster around the world than previously. Although not like today, just imagine around the world in 80 days. Today you can do it in a day or a couple days by airplane. But back then that was a big deal, going around the world in 80 days. And so he had this bet, And he set off from London and by train and to the Mediterranean, took a ship to the Suez Canal, and another ship down around Arabia to India. He crossed India by train, another ship to Hong Kong, and then another ship to San Francisco, and then a train across the U.S., and then another ship across the Atlantic Ocean to London. And I believe he made it. So it's a wonderful geography, these different countries, and different peoples he meets, and has lots of adventures. It's a tremendous story. And the next book is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, also by Jules Verne. It came out in 1870. So this is a book about the oceans, and Jules Verne really learned a lot. Boy, these books he wrote, there's so much science, and based on what he was speculating about. They didn't really know. This is before the submarine era, where they could really explore the depths of the ocean. So he was speculating. That's what science fiction is speculating about, taking current science and speculating about the future. And this is what he did. And he was writing about this submarine that's going on. It's traveling 20,000 leagues. So this is a prophetic book about submarines, which came to become reality in the future. They used to say if Jules Verne wrote about it, it would come true. He would write about it first. Okay, the next book is Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss, published in 1960. And this is good timing for me. I was born in 1960, and this is probably the first book that I encountered. And I remember my mother reading it to me. The Dr. Seuss books are very pleasant, very nice for young children, a good way for them to start reading, because there's rhyming and it's funny and so forth. And it's a good book. It's for very young children. The next book is The Call of the Wild by Jack London, published in 1903. This is a book about a wolf that is, I think, a baby wolf that is taken, becomes a pet, becomes a person's, a pet of a person, and then, but it's always, the call, it feels attracted to the wild, and so that's what it's all about. And I believe at the end it goes back to the wild, because that's where it feels comfortable, and it's. And so it's all about sort of this conflict among this animal, if you're a dog, for let's say a tame wolf that's been, wolves are dogs, so it's possible that you could have a wolf that could be a pet, because they are dogs, and dogs are man's best friend, and so, so dogs have the, if you're a dog, you have the advantage of having an owner taking care of you and so forth, and you work for him, but if you're in the wild, you have your freedom, and it's a completely different life, and you're out there, of course you have to hunt for food, but in a way it's more exciting, you can roam around, and whereas if you're a dog, who knows, you're just stuck at home, or if you're on a leash, you don't have much freedom, so it's kind of gets into those differences between a domesticated dog and a wild wolf. Okay, the next book is Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, written in 1927. Now, Hermann Hesse was one of my favorite authors years ago, back in the 80s. He writes very well. The books are very compelling. And this book, this Steppenwolf, is about a character who, kind of like Call of the Wild, he's a guy who kind of enjoys sort of pushing the envelope, or, doing dangerous things and going out in the wilderness and getting in touch with his wild side. And experiencing some hardships and the elements and so forth. And it's a fairly short book. Hermann Hesse writes very, very well, and I highly recommend his books. Okay, the next book is Meetings with Remarkable Men by George Gurdjieff, published in 1963. Now, this is a really, really good book. This guy, he met sort of holy people in different parts of, in exotic places, especially Central Asia, and he traveled and was looking for special people that were maybe obscure, not well known. And so he would meet them and talk with them, and that's what this book is all about. And they were, as I recall, it was in Central Asia. So we're about out of time. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate it, and we'll keep going next time. God bless you, and all the best. See you next time.